candidate for the master's degree in another college. And I have the I take the honor to give him, before I turn turn to him to give us his presentation. I would like to give a few remarks on based on his bio. He hails from Nigeria. I forgot what state. Is it Ondo? Ojo?
Oyo,
Oyo.
Oyo State.
Oyo State. And he attended he attended the University of Ibadan, where he earned the Bachelor of Science in Agricultural and Environmental Engineering in 2015. And 3 years later, he came to FAMU. He started in the fall of 2018, and he has been a graduate research assistant since then up to this time. He has, aside from academics, he has done some community services, he has been the president, or I don't know if he still is the president of the Baptist Collegiate Ministry at Florida A&M University. He has been the representative graduate student representative of the Manners of the FAMU chapter. He is also served as treasurer of the Graduate Assistants United at the university, and a senator, graduate assistant United in the university. What stands out to me is that in 2019 must have been his year, because he presented attended and presented papers and oral presentations and poster presentations at 5 different workshops or seminars or whatever they are. He listed them in his bio. And he also has completed a working in preparation a paper publication soon to be published in the I don't know. Have you decided what journal are you shooting for?
Journal of Forest Ecology and Management.
Okay. Okay. So there's more to say about him, but maybe he can give us some more later on in the question and answer part of the program. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ojo and to give us his presentation based on his thesis. Take away, Ojo.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I'd like to say thank you to everyone for coming. It's so exciting for me to see so many familiar faces, and I really appreciate it, and it means a lot to me. I'll be presenting on water yield impact on forest ecosystem restoration, looking at the Ocala National Forest as a case study. As an overview of my research, I'll be highlighting the objectives of my research. I'll be discussing some important concepts. I'll be explaining my methods and then give the results and conclusion. So at the Ocala National Forest, which is where I conducted my research, the vast majority of vegetation can be characterized as the sandpine dominated ecosystem. The sandpines were planted in order to service the lumber industry, but there's recently been concerns about certain endemic species of wildlife on the Ocala National Forest that are declining in population as a result of the unfavorable sandpine habitat. So in response to the declining wildlife, large-scale efforts are in place to restore the sandpine-dominated ecosystem to the original oak scrub ecosystem. and over 20,000 hectares of sandpine habitat has been prescribed for this ecosystem restoration. My research looks at the impact of this forest ecosystem restoration on water yield. This research was formulated in response to questions from the management team at the Ocala National Forest. They wanted to know how their intended management practice, that is the conversion of sandpine vegetation to oak scrub ecosystem, they wanted to know how this management practice will affect the hydrologic cycle. So we designed a study to provide some information that would be useful to management at the Ocala National Forest. The image on the right shows my experimental site. The yellow dots represent species that characterize the sandpine dominated ecosystem, while the red dots represent species located at the oak scrub ecosystem. The objectives of this research were to compare transpiration dynamics in two contrasting ecosystems. So we had two forest ecosystems, the sandpine dominated ecosystem and the oak scrub ecosystem. And our first objective was to compare transpiration dynamics among different plant species in these ecosystems under varying environmental conditions. And the second objective was to estimate the stand level or ecosystem level components of evapotranspiration. Now, by way of introduction, here we have the components of the hydrologic cycle of the forest ecosystem, including precipitation, evapotranspiration, overland flow, subsurface flow, and groundwater flow. We see that there are numerous components of the hydrologic cycle of this forest ecosystem. And in order to account for the water budget of this vegetative ecosystem, we need to examine the vegetation and scale down to the plant level and see what components of the hydrologic cycle directly affect the plants, Then once we can account for these components, we can scale back up to the stand level or ecosystem level of the hydrologic cycle. Now, a closer look at the plant level components of the hydrologic cycle, we have precipitation, throughfall, which is the component of precipitation that makes it to the forest floor, interception, which is the difference between precipitation and throughfall. My research measures three primary components of plant level water balance: transpiration, throughfall, and precipitation. This component adequately satisfies the objective of my research, which again has to do with the measurement of species-specific transpiration and stand-level evapotranspiration. We assumed soil evaporation to be negligible because the soil was extremely dry and the sandy soil quickly drains any form of precipitation. So here are the species across ecosystems, consisting of the sandpine, myrtle oaks, Chapman oaks, and sandlife oak. The sandpine dominated ecosystem also consisted of some oak scrub species, but the pine ecosystem was sparsely populated compared to the oak scrub ecosystem, which had a densely populated vegetation. Now, over to some of the environmental parameters that I measured. I measured solar radiation using the pyranometer. Solar radiation supplies energy for evaporation. I measured evaporative demand of ambient air through the relative humidity and air temperature sensor. Soil moisture was measured using water content reflectometers. Throughfall, which again is the amount of precipitation that reaches the forest floor, was measured using tipping bucket rain gauges. The tipping bucket rain gauge was also used to measure precipitation. A data logger was used to monitor and record data of all environmental sensors continuously, and the entire system was powered by solar radiation. Here we have the cross-sectional area of a tree. consisting of the sapwood area, the heartwood area, and the bark. The sapwood area is the moisture conducting part of the stem, and depending on the type of plant, the rate of sap flow in the sapwood area varies per species. Sap flux probes were used to measure the rate of sap flow. The sap flux probe that I used is a thermal dissipation probe. This type of probe works basically like thermometers that are able to measure the temperature difference between points A and B. Probe A serves the dual purpose of temperature sensor and heater. So during the day, when transpiration is really high, the heat at sensor A is dissipated quickly, and the difference between sensors A and B is nearly zero. But at night, when there is zero flow, it gets to build up around sensor A, and then difference in temperature becomes maximum. So there is a diurnal pattern that depends on the rate of flow in the sapwood area. And this is a picture of me fabricating the probes that I used in the field. Now, because sap flow only occurs in the sapwood area, it was very important to determine the sapwood area for both pine and oak scrub species. The first step was to measure the diameter at breast height using a diameter tape. And then for the pine trees, tree cores were extracted using an increment borer. Here's a picture of me extracting tree cores. The tree core is a section of wood tissue that shows both heartwood and sapwood. The tree cores were glued to wooden trays, sanded with an orbital sander, and visually inspected for the extent of sapwood. For the oak scrub species, the determination of sapwood area was also done by visually inspecting the diffusion of a dye across the stem segments. Stem segments of scrub oak species was found to consist mostly of sapwood area. Now, next is the estimation of transpiration and total sap flow. Mean sap flux density or unit sap flux density is given as shown, where K is the flow index and C and D are constant. The flow index is a metric that tells us about sap flow in the sapwood area and is given as shown. The T max T is the maximum temperature difference at time T, and the TT is the temperature difference at time T. So if the T max T and the TT are the same, then there would be zero flow. That is, if the maximum temperature difference measured by the probes in the sapwood area up until time T is the same as the temperature difference at time T, then the flow index would be zero, meaning zero sap flow, which is the condition we have at night time. The challenge, however, is to determine the time varying maximum temperature difference and then calculate the changing flow index, because the raw data from the sap flux probes only gives the temperature difference at time T. So in order to calculate the changing maximum temperature difference and flow index, I used a sap flux data processing software, which I'll talk more about on the next slide. By multiplying the sap flux density by the sapwood area, we can calculate the total sap flow. The evaporative flux is then given as the sum of transpiration, interception, and soil evaporation. Soil evaporation was considered negligible because we observed from the preliminary soil moisture data that the soil was particularly well drained and had sufficient vegetative cover. Finally, water yield can be estimated as precipitation minus evapotranspiration. Now here's a screenshot of the sap flux data processing software, and we see the diurnal pattern of sap flow representing the temperature difference between the heated and unheated sensors. The red line is the DT max line that is automatically calculated by the software, but can also be manually edited. And based on this line, the flow index for the entire time series is calculated. Because of the enormous amount of data, I also used Python and MATLAB for data analysis. Now over to some results. Graph A is the graph of daily soil moisture. B is the graph of vapor pressure deficit, and C is the graph of solar radiation. For graph A, we see that the same pattern of daily soil moisture, we see the same pattern of daily soil moisture across sites. However, soil moisture declines more rapidly at the oak scrub site. The month of August through September is a really good example showing a more rapid decline at the oak scrub site than at the pine site. Now, after a rain event rewets the soil, as we can see on the graph, there is an exponential decline in soil moisture. The initial quick decline is as a result of drainage through the soil, but with time, the majority of the decline is evapotranspiration. Graph B, or the vapor pressure deficit graph, shows little or no difference in vapor pressure deficits across sites. The reason is because the sites were only about 150 meters apart, so parameters for calculating vapor pressure deficits such as air temperature and relative humidity were more or less the same across sites. I'll talk more about vapor pressure deficits in the coming slides. The dotted lines show predicted values where I used a machine learning algorithm, specifically random forest regression, to predict values when one of the sites was down. However, there were days when both sites were down because of excessive bear activity. So if we take a short time series of about 3 days and compare the daily pattern of vapor pressure deficit with the daily pattern of surflux density or unit transpiration, we see that all species across sites show a similar pattern of transpiration compared to the pattern of vapor pressure deficit. This shows that surflux density was tightly coupled with vapor pressure deficit. We see that for days 237 and 238, midday drops in vapor pressure deficit due to short storms or precipitation resulted in short-term depression in the surflux density because vapor pressure deficit again is a driver for transpiration. We can see that the surflux density is significantly lower in the sand pines than in the oak scrubs. These graphs show the daily surflux pattern for each species within and between sites. The right-hand side, or species B1, B2, and B3, represents species at the oak scrub site, while the left-hand side, or species A1, A2, and A3, represents species at the pine site. For these graphs, we looked at days when the volumetric water content was greater than 0.005 meter cube per meter cube, and the mean vapor pressure deficit was in the upper quartile of all recorded values. We wanted to know the species-specific transpiration rates under optimum conditions. Each of the black lines represents the diurnal pattern of transpiration for 1 day. So each graph shows several days of daily transpiration. The solid colored lines are the averages of all the days. For figure C below, figure C shows the normalized averages for each of the species across sites. This graph allows us to compare when transpiration starts, when it peaks, and when transpiration ends for each of the species. We noticed that the oak scrub species, with the exemption of Chapman oak, showed a rapid increase in surflux and reached a peak value before noon at around 10:30 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. while the sand pines increased transpiration more gradually and reached a peak value at noon. An early decline in sap flow was observed among the oak scrub species, with the sand pines having a more extended evening tail, as you will see with the red line on graph C. The time lag in diurnal transpiration rates observed in the sand pines compared to the oak scrub species is as a result of the phenomenon known as capacitance. So because the sand pines have a much larger stem, they are able to use up stored water to help buffer ambient drivers for evaporation. Another thing that we can observe from the graph is that species common to both sides actually show a similar pattern of sap flux, which tells us that species-specific sap flux pattern may be independent of site. For these graphs, we summed up the daily sap flux density for each of the species throughout the study period, and then plotted a graph of daily sap flux density versus vapor pressure deficit. But then we sorted the sap flux density data for days when the soil moisture values were above a threshold value of 0.005 meter cube per meter cube, and days when the soil moisture was below 0.005. The blue color on the graph represents non-limiting conditions. That is, days when soil moisture was above the threshold value, while the red color represents limiting conditions. That is, days when the soil moisture was below the threshold value of 0.005 meter cube per meter cube. This analysis enabled us to examine both species response to limiting soil moisture and species transpiration. There was a log-log linear relationship between vapor pressure deficit and sap flux density for the limiting and non-limiting conditions. And this relationship showed that most species behaved differently at limiting and non-limiting conditions. So using the regression parameters of the log-log linear relationship between vapor pressure deficit and sap flux density, I estimated sap flux density at unit vapor pressure deficit. And then I was able to come up with reference values for sap flow at limiting and non-limiting conditions for each species. By plotting a graph of sap flow at limiting condition versus sap flow at the non-limiting condition, I was able to determine the drop in transpiration or sap flow due to low soil moisture. As you would see, values for Chapman oak were close to the one-to-one line, indicating that transpiration stays the same for Chapman oak if soil moisture drops below 0.005 meter cube per meter cube. However, other species fell below the one-to-one line, indicating that under similar atmospheric conditions, but low soil moisture, the transpiration rate would decline for most species. So this graph summarizes species response to limiting soil moisture conditions. On the x-axis are the species, while the y-axis show the percentage of maximum transpiration. We see that Matthew oak, sandlife oak, and sand pines show a significant decrease in transpiration under limiting soil moisture conditions. We also see that the scrub oaks behaved differently, but sand pines' response to drought is not significantly different from any of the oak scrub species. Now, this table is a summary of species average transpiration rates based on the reference sap flux values under non-limiting conditions. We see that transpiration rate was not significantly different among the oak scrub species. However, the sand pines behaved differently compared to the oak scrub species, and transpiration was significantly lower in the sand pines than in the oak scrub species. Here is a visual summary of species water use and drought response. We have seen that water use was similar among the oak scrub species. So the green line represents the average transpiration rate of the oak scrub species, while the solid brown line represents the transpiration rates for the pine species. We have also seen that the species responded differently to water limiting conditions. So the dotted lines represent species response to water limiting conditions. For the oak scrub species, we see that matul oak showed the greatest decline in transpiration under limiting soil moisture conditions, while Chapman oak showed the least change in transpiration under dry conditions. Here are the formulas based on the log-log linear relationship that describes sap flow as a function of vapor pressure deficit for the sand pines and oak scrub species. Now, so far, the analyses I have presented were not scaled to include the entire sapwood area, but the next set of analyses I'll be presenting are tree level and stand level estimates of transpiration. So I decided to show the our empirical or our allometric equation of sapwood area for each species as a function of dBH. So here is an overview of the unit transpiration and tree level transpiration. So from the diameter at breast height, we can determine the sapwood area. And by multiplying the sapwood area with the unit transpiration, we get the tree level transpiration. The unit transpiration is the transpiration per 1 unit of sapwood area, or 1 meter squared of sapwood area. So when you multiply that by the entire sapwood area in meters squared, you get the tree level transpiration. Although we see that the average sapwood area was much higher in the sand pines compared to the matul oak species, tree level transpiration was higher in the matul oak compared to the sand pines. Now the sand pine is a much larger tree. Tree level transpiration was still lower because its unit transpiration was lower compared to the oak scrub species. Also, we see that matul oak had a similar tree level transpiration rate at both sites. Here is the unit transpiration and tree level transpiration of sand live oak. So far, we see that unit transpiration is much higher in the oak scrub species. Generally, the smaller the stem, the faster the unit transpiration rate. On average, unit transpiration was highest in the matul oak and least in the sand pines, while tree level transpiration was highest in the matul oak and least in the Chapman oak. Based on our stand survey data, the estimated sapwood area per hectare was larger in the pine sites than in the oak scrub sites. But we would see on the next slide that a higher total sapwood area at the pine site did not result in a larger stand level transpiration, simply because the oak scrub site had an overall higher rate of average unit transpiration. For this set of results, we compared stand level transpiration at both sites. The total transpiration rates under non-limiting conditions trends towards being higher at the oak scrub site compared to the pine site. We also see that the pine site had more water surplus days. Comparing sites under low moisture conditions shows that the oak scrub site trends towards having a higher transpiration rate. We also see that the oak scrub site had more days of water deficit. Comparing the daily transpiration total for the study period shows that the oak scrub site trends towards having a higher total transpiration. The other important difference that we were looking for across sites that will help us to quantify the water budget at this contrasting ecosystem is throughfall. We wanted to know which site receives more moisture from rainfall. So on the x-axis of this graph, we have total incoming precipitation per rain event. And on the y-axis, we have throughfall. The red color represents the oak scrub site, while the black color represents the pine site. There was a linear relationship between precipitation and throughfall. So when we examined the spatially averaged throughfall across sites, as you can see on the graph, we found out that throughfall was 20% greater at the pine site than at the oak scrub site. And then in order to validate our estimate of throughfall, we looked at an alternative method of estimating throughfall by looking at the daily positive changes in soil moisture for each site. So a positive daily change in soil moisture would mean that more moisture was added to the soil, which corresponds to throughfall. The x-axis on this graph represents the pine sites, while the y-axis represents the oak scrub site. The center line is the one-to-one line. And so if all the points fall on that line, it means that throughfall is the same in the pine sites as in the oak scrub site. But we see that most of the points fall below the one-to-one line, meaning that for a given value of throughfall at the pine site, there was a corresponding lower value for the oak scrub site. So comparing the daily averages in soil moisture also showed that throughfall rather was greater in the pine site than at the oak scrub site, which is similar to our findings from the throughfall collectors. The relationship between throughfall and precipitation is given as shown. Now, here is an overview of the stand level water balance with respect to the tree level water balance. So we went into this study focusing on what we considered as the biggest or largest components of evapotranspiration. However, we were not able to address all of these components because of the limitation of time and resources. So the components of the tree level water balance that was measured: interception, transpiration, and evapotranspiration, which is the sum of interception and transpiration, as well as precipitation. The parameters that we could not measure include stem flow and soil evaporation. Stem flow is the precipitation that is initially intercepted by the vegetation, but then drains down the stems and eventually reaches the soil. Studies show that stem flow could range from 3 to 8% of precipitation. Also, soil evaporation, which is typically the smallest component of the evaporative flux in forested ecosystems, also can add up to the total evaporative flux. So given the parameters of the tree level water balance that we did not measure, we may not be able to make strong conclusions about the stand level water budget at this point. So further studies that include replicated study sites as well as a measurement of the other components of the water budget is necessary as a result, following the results of this study. In conclusion, a reminder of my objectives. The first objective was to compare transpiration dynamics among the dominant species in the oak scrub and sandpine ecosystems under varying environmental conditions. And secondly was to estimate stand level components of evapotranspiration in the two communities. And here are my conclusions. Higher species transpiration rates and vegetation abundance at the oak scrub site resulted in higher transpiration and interception. Species unit subflow rates and drought response rather than subfood area largely influenced stand level transpiration. Now, provided that the results obtained in this case study translates to the general sandpine sites at the Ocala National Forest, then the intended management efforts to promote wildlife habitats at the Ocala National Forest aimed at the conversion of the pine ecosystem to the oak scrub vegetation may actually result in a reduction in potential water yield. Here's my publication in preparation. And I would really like to express my profound gratitude to my committee members, the faculty and staff of the College of Agriculture and Food Sciences, and my colleagues and friends. This picture was taken at the Ocala National Forest, where my committee members went with me to set up my experiments. In total, my committee members were on the field with me for almost 2 weeks, just setting up my experiment. The level of support I have received, both professionally and in terms of encouragement, motivation from my major professor and every member of my committee, has truly been amazing to me. There are many occasions when they've gone out of their way to really, really support me. And I just want you to know that I really appreciate you and thank you very much. From the left to right is Dr. Johnny Grace, Dr. Lucy Ngatia, my major professor, and Dr. Alfredo Lorenzo, my second major professor, and my colleague Iyanu. I would like to also really appreciate Dr. Chris Oishi, as is also a member of my committee. He played a primary role in my experiments, setup, and data analysis. Dr. Chris, you've really inspired me, and I would like to really thank you very much. I would like to also appreciate Miss Christine, I'm sorry, to my right, who taught me how to make the sap flux probes. Thank you so much. This picture was taken at the Kuwaita Hydrologic Laboratory, where I got trained on instrumentation and data analysis. I would like to appreciate my colleagues and friends. From left to right is Olumide, Sheon, and Iyanu. Thank you so much for going to the field with me. Once again, I would like to thank everyone who has supported me in one way or the other. Thank you so much. And now I'll entertain questions.
So thank you, Israel, for that very good presentation. And so we are going to open the floor for questions.
Yeah, and I would like to add that before you ask your question, identify yourself and your agency that you're associated with.
Hello, Israel. Nice job. Very good job. I have a question regarding the longer term implications that may impact wildlife on the forest in terms of water yield by the conversion to oak from sandpine.
Oh, okay. Thank you. For my study, we cannot really extrapolate in terms of long-term effect, because, like I explained, there are components of the water budgets that were not measured. So based on my study, I can't really say this is, there's a limitation to my study, is basically what I'm trying to say. But one thing that is very clear is that we have been able to establish that transpiration rate is lower in the sandpines compared to the oak scrub species. We've been able to establish an equation that describes vapor pressure deficit with daily sap flow in the sandpines and the oak scrub species. So in terms of transpiration, we are certain about what transpiration rate can be given if we know what the vapor pressure deficit in an area is. But beyond that, I may not be able to really give a definite answer as to whether or not converting the vegetation may be beneficial or not in terms of water yield. I don't know if that satisfies, if that answers your question.
Sure. Yeah, totally understand. I appreciate that. By the way, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Paul Medley. I work for the USDA Forest Service and also FAMU Center for Spatial Ecology and Restoration. Again, very nice job, Israel. Good data, good information. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, this is Kelly Russell. I'm the forest supervisor for the National Forest in Florida. And I just wanted to thank you and your colleagues for all the work y'all are doing to help us better understand the processes at work on the National Forest. I'm not a forester by trade, so I'm not even going to begin to try to ask you an intelligent question. But I do want to thank you for your work, and it is much appreciated by us, since we don't always have the ability to go out and do such type of research ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly.
Hi, this is Jason, hydrologist with Forest Service. I'm Dr. Johnny Gray's colleague. I got a question about the transpiration for other understory. I found that the total kind of very small. In my impression, the total ET is about half of your precipitation. In Florida, generally we say maybe 80% or something. If you look at the watershed level data, if you look at the USGS gauging station, you calculate the runoff. Normally they were, 40% or something. I was wondering, is the understory, like all the weed, all the grass, they were important for your total ET?
So the total evapotranspiration was a scaled up value based on the unit transpiration, and also based on the value of throughfall. There are a number of parameters that have been included. So number one, we are certain of the transpiration rates, which is what we measured, via the subflux probes. There are other things that may have influenced that disparity, such as the stand survey data, which of course we worked with the Ocala National Forest, and so we worked based on their stand survey data. So that value is a scaled up value. Also precipitation, we also made use of data from nearby meteorological stations. So this different parts of estimating evapotranspiration, well, based on what we've measured, that's the value that we got. And I understand that there's a big gap between both sides, but I cannot really say that this is the reason why, but I'm just trying to lay out that there are a number of other pieces in the entire equation that may have influenced the disparity that we have. But we are certain of the measurement of transpiration and throughfall in this species. So so that's basically what I can conclusively talk about, that okay, the transpiration rate in this species so and so. But in terms of the total evapotranspiration, yeah, I agree that there's a disparity between both sides, a large disparity.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. That's very good work. So we know a little, better, part of the oak. I was also impressed by the soil moisture content. So what exactly the range for the 0.005 is very low.
Yes. Yes.
So that's very common for 0.005. That's only 0.5% of soil moisture.
Yes. Actually, 10% of all the the soil moisture values that we got was below 0.002 meter cube per meter. So the soil is actually very well drained, and that's why we were confident of saying that soil moisture is negligible, because it's basically very, very dry soil type. And so any form of precipitation that comes upon it quickly drains down. And so there's almost no soil evaporation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Good morning. This is George Guevara with the Forest Service. Great job. It really interesting stuff. I'm glad to see it all culminate and come together. I had a quick question. If you looked at the leaf area index at all, and if there's any correlation between what you were finding with the sap flow and the leaf area for each species.
So we did not measure the leaf area index for this study. So that's also something that can be measured in further follow-up studies. So I cannot say much about how the leaf area affects transpiration or maybe throughfall. So sorry, can give that.
No worries. I just wasn't sure if that was a parameter that you guys looked at. No,
No.
appreciate it. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you, George.
Any other question?
Be quiet.
We still have time for any other question.
I just want to, the title. I was confused initially, potential water yield on forest ecosystem restoration, but here seems you corrected. I was confused, what this all about, I think this is correct, you're talking about the forest restoration on the water yield, not another, water yield on the forest restoration. I was confused.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's the impact of the restoration, the management plan at the Ocala National Forest. I guess the verbiage may be a little bit, but basically what the topic is looking at the impact of the restoration plan on potential water yield. So
Hi, Israel. This is Dr. Thomas. I think you did an excellent job. I'm so proud of you and your committee. Great job. For a non-forester, I just had a couple of questions. One, what impact does your study have on what the Forest Service is doing? Do you have any recommendations as a result? And also, your study seems to be dependent on seasons. If I don't know if I'm correct. So when you were doing the study, did you have to make sure you were within a certain time period, say from this month to that month? I just don't know.
So for the first question, well, this study really provides non-existent transpiration rate for the sand pines. Up until now, there is no literature that gives information about transpiration rates in the sand pines. So now we have that information. And so, well, because really there are several components, or not several, a couple of components that was not measured. So there is a framework for further studies to be carried out regarding the evapotranspiration of the forest ecosystem. So, but yes, we do have information relating to transpiration for each of the species, the species-specific transpiration rate. And so based on that and based on throughfall, there are other studies that needs to be carried out. And for the seasonal variation, yes, the study was conducted over a partial hydrologic year. So we made sure to include both the dry season months and the wet season months in order to be able to compare the dynamics of transpiration in this, the seasonal changes in transpiration at the different species. So yeah, we made sure to include that. And all of this information is in my thesis, and it also will be published in my research article.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Best
Thomas.
wishes in your next step professionally.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Thank you.
Okay.
If we have no further questions, we are going to say thank you very much to everyone who participated. Thank you to our university members. Thank you to our external collaborators. We really appreciate your collaboration and your working with us. We know it has been a teamwork, and we very much appreciate that teamwork, and we look forward to continued collaboration and working together. And so we are very, very, very grateful. And so with that, we are going to end here, and also to mention that Israel has been accepted to University of Florida in the College of Biological and Agricultural Engineering, where he'll be doing his PhD starting fall 2020. And so on his successful defense, depending on that success, we hope that he will be able to go ahead and start his PhD. So again, thank you for all the support. We appreciate it. And I think we will terminate the public presentation here. So thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.